Today's episode is sponsored by HireSuite. HireSuite CRM helps talent acquisition teams hire more people by automating your outreach and nurturing your talent pipelines, allowing your talent teams to be a lot more productive. If you haven't tried HireSuite, head to hiresuite.com and try it out for free.
Welcome to Crafty Sourcer. If you're looking for a raw, unfiltered podcast on all things sourcing in APAC, you've come to the right place. Grab a coffee or wine and join your host and other guests as we dive deep into the complex and ever-evolving world of sourcing, keeping you informed on insights, tools, and even at times, a healthy sourcing debate or two. Now, here's your host, Denise Pereira from Kaleidosource. Settle in and let's get crafty.
Welcome back to another episode of Crafty Sourcer. Now, you know how we always promise you top-notch guests? Well, today is no exception. This person can spot great talent from a mile away and is an amazing human being. She's also the head of talent at Lab 17, and when she isn't hiring or partnering with startups, she's catching some vitamin D at the beach. Cloë Stanbridge, welcome, and it is so good to have you join us this morning.
Thanks so much, Denise. That was a great intro. Great to be here.
Now, Cloë, before we always start, we always ask our guests to do a quick intro. Who is Cloë and how did you fall in love with sourcing?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. As you mentioned, I'm the head of talent at the Lab 17, and we embed ourselves into startups and scale-ups. We help companies grow, and basically we'll go into a company to help them build the foundations for a high-performing talent function. We'll put the process in place and then we make great hires as well. But I started in the recruitment industry when, like most people, fell into it in 2013. And I wouldn't say I fell in love with sourcing straight away. I was actually quite petrified. I was working in an agency and I literally think on my first day, they asked me to call a software development manager at Optiver to do a BD call. And then on the flip side of that, start sourcing candidates that I could share. And I went into full panic mode, had to Google what a software engineer was, etc., etc. Once I started to lean into vulnerability and started to build relationships, though, with candidates and hiring managers, really to understand roles better and understand what the candidates do, that's when I really started to enjoy it. And I remember being back in agency, I'd get a new role on and that thrill of diving into LinkedIn or into our database to start sourcing. And I think that's when I really started to love it, when I got to know candidates a lot better and the sourcing piece in terms of what's on their profile, but then what else is it that we're looking for outside of that, you know, that we can find those real niche candidates that aren't just great on paper, but then when we talk to them, they start to tick a lot of those other boxes too.
I love that. It's a bit of the fear of the unknown, right? So
Absolutely.
It kind of reminds me of when I started and I had no idea what SAP actually meant. And Google becomes your best friend. I still till today sometimes struggle with the acronym of SAP and what it exactly means. But I think sourcing is one of those things where you do get petrified if you're not sure of what it exactly is and how you need to go about it. But everything starts with curiosity.
Yeah. And also you don't want to reach out to a candidate. I'll use the, good old example of Java versus JavaScript. And maybe you reach out to a Java candidate and you're looking for a front-end engineer. And then you get that response early in your career when they're like, have you not read my profile? I'm a Java engineer. I do the back end. I don't do front end. It's just like, oh. But it's these little things that you do just that keep you motivated and keep you learning and wanting to understand better.
That's a great point, Cloë. Just shifting gears a bit here. As we know, sourcing isn't just about finding candidates. It's absolutely a mindset. To some degree, some people even say it's an art. In terms of the way people need to be thinking, and obviously with your experience and how you started and where you are now, what are some of the elements or steps people need to be, or what they need to be start thinking of when they start their sourcing journey?
I think reflecting back on my career, and if I go back to, that thrill of being in an agency, you get a new role on, you're up against the clock. It's a little bit different when you're in an internal role. And what I learned was to slow down and understand the market before I just dived straight in. And what I mean by that is don't assume, really break it down. For example, if we're looking for a JavaScript engineer who has built a B2B platform, actually looking at where that talent sits within the market For example, are we looking in Australia? Does this candidate need to be based in Sydney? Is it a hybrid? And looking, and you can use tools like LinkedIn to help build that market map for you, but have an idea of the market before you dive straight into your search. Because you might be really excited with your hiring manager, you might get really excited about the search. Yeah, we can find this, we can find this. And then all of a sudden you realize we actually don't have the talent in the market. I was looking for a UX researcher recently, and over the first week or so, I worked with the hiring manager, and they were looking for very niche experience. And what we found in the Sydney market, because this person needed to come into the office, we found there were really, really experienced UX researchers, and there were very junior UX researchers, but there weren't many with that kind of 3 to 4 years of experience. So as we went through LinkedIn, we broke it down. I said, all right, these are the companies that we want this candidate to have worked in or come from, because it needed to be very specific B2B. We went through all the companies, we went through the level of experience, and we were able to demonstrate the pool of candidates that might have been available if they were interested. And then we said, look, we'll take this number and then we'll break it down. So realistically, if these 5 candidates don't come back to me and aren't the right candidate, something's going to change. And it was just so good to have those insights with the hiring manager and talk them through this before we got 3 or 4 weeks into the search. We don't have any candidates. They're looking at me like I don't know how to do my job. And I think, as you mentioned, sourcing is a mindset. It's going out and actively trying to find the candidates, but it's also working with your hiring manager to make sure that they're being brought on the journey. And having that qualification piece at the start is so, so important. Like spending the time diving in with the hiring manager. What are you looking for? Okay, from what you said, here's a few candidates that match that criteria. Is this what you mean? Yes, I like this. Now I'm just further qualifying that. So then once you have that really nice picture painted of the profile of the candidate, well, then you can go and source. And then you know what you're dealing with. And if there are a very small number of candidates, maybe it's not you who's reaching out to those candidates. Maybe it's the hiring manager and it's coming directly from them. Whereas if you've hundreds of candidates available that fit the criteria, well, then maybe you take a different approach.
That is such a critical point that you've just brought up around educating the hiring manager, because you can save yourself so much of pain down the line from doing that. Number one, you're educating them upfront so that week 2, week 3 in, if there's any issues, you can very tactfully and early on in the process change your approach. And if, again, there's any surprises that happen, the hiring manager is not surprised by the data that you've provided. So they already know that, hey, this role is going to be a bit of a struggle. Maybe we need to change our approach and our requirements based on what the market is actually saying. The other thing with bringing data and insights to the forefront, what happens with that is go back and look at your historical data sometimes. Mm-hmm. If you've already been, let's say if this role is not your first hire and you'll have hired this role in previous months or years, look at that as well. Did you have pain points back then? Obviously, the market has shifted, but use that as an ammunition and go back to the hiring manager and say, this is the data that we had, this is what we're looking at, and then you can tweak your strategies accordingly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it shifts their mindset as well, because, again, I'm sure we've all been on this journey where we think that the first few candidates that we share are 10 out of 10s. One of those is going to get the job. And then they reject them for whatever reason. And then we're 6 weeks into the search and we realize maybe we actually should have gone with one of those candidates in the beginning, because now they understand the market. Now they understand that they were the best. And of course, that's a really poor candidate experience if we then say, oh, actually, we want to reconsider you. We've changed the role. Whereas doing all of this up front and not having to take candidates through that learning experience, and of course, just waste a lot of time from the TA or the recruiter or from the hiring manager and the team, do it all up front, get on the same page and have that clarity. And then go after the candidates.
Really good point there, Chloe. And you bring up a very important point that I think all of us have faced around, where we go through this whole life cycle of bringing people in through an interview process. And then the hiring manager is like, no, I'm looking for that perfect candidate. And then all of a sudden they realize there is no perfect candidate. And then we go back to the same pool of candidates and we've already lost out. They've gone somewhere else. They've gone to a competitor. And sometimes the only way to mitigate that risk is by going with plan A, which is obviously use those data and insights. You're already educating them. And this is where the hiring manager needs to really rely on that source or recruiter, whoever is partnering with them, as the SME. Now, let's talk about, sometimes people think we need to invest in fancy sourcing tech or tools or platform to look for people. But the reality is we don't need to. You can very easily do a Google X-ray search and sometimes find people, and coupled with another, few other platforms or avenues to look for candidates. In your experience and with what you've done, like what are some of the basic tools and platforms that someone should consider using when they're tasked with sourcing talent for the first time?
I love this question because we joke at the lab and we say, okay, what would you do if LinkedIn didn't exist tomorrow? And where would you go? And we brainstorm around that because I think we all just naturally default, especially if you've got a recruiter license. We default to that. Candidates are used to getting approached on LinkedIn. It's easy to navigate, but there's so many other ways that we can find candidates. One that I love is going on to meetup groups. Let's say UX researcher, for example, go into one of the latest Sydney ones if that's where you're after your candidates. Join one of the meetups. If you can go to the event, great. If not, you've got the attendee list. You can go through all of those and then you can cross-reference if you do have LinkedIn. And it doesn't even need to be a paid account either. It's easy to cross-reference, contact the candidate directly, try add them and say, I noticed that you're part of this meetup group, so am I, and make that connection pretty easily. That's probably my favorite one. As you mentioned, there's Google searches, just even using the plain part of LinkedIn without the paid. You can still get pretty far in your searches as well if you search via company or via job title. For engineering, GitHub, it takes a little bit of navigating and getting used to, so you might want a software engineer to show you how. But let's say, for example, you need to find a Node.js backend candidate, and you can find candidates there that have contributed to a lot of open source projects using Node.js. And a lot of the times they'll have their email address on there too. So you can actually reach out then with a really unique message. I came across you on GitHub, or even better, I was working with our senior software engineer, Mary. She noticed that you have all this experience contributing to these projects. This is very similar to the type of work that we're doing at X company. Would you be interested in a chat so I can share more about a potential role opportunity with us?
Is there a hack that you can share that you tried and it worked out so well for you that possibly either it turned into a hire or just something where you've been nurturing this candidate?
I've probably got a few examples that will pop up as I think through this. My favorite one, actually, it's a little bit of a shift away from the sourcing element, but originally I'd found, and maybe actually it does fall into the whole sourcing piece, but I had sourced a candidate. I can't remember how. This was quite a few years ago. I took the candidate through the process. We had it completely built out where all the interviewers were giving us beautiful objective feedback. We knew exactly why we were rejecting or progressing candidates through. It was working really well. We ended up rejecting the candidate after the technical interview. And then he said, thanks so much. I know what I need to improve on. By the way, would you consider my brother? Here's his CV. And we ended up interviewing that candidate. So that was my absolute favorite story, because it's all these little links that you take for granted as you go through sourcing, or even giving one candidate. Actually, I was working on Linktree year before last, I think, and I hired a product designer, and she reached out to me then a few months later. She said, I had such an awesome experience with you. Can I introduce you to my partner? He's on the market now, and he's looking for a new role within the strategy and ops space. And I had a chat with him. So there's the sourcing element, which is, kind of the start from scratch, no network piece. But I think we should also really consider our existing network first. And when we do start to source, it's like, all right, well, who do we know? Who can I reach out to? What kind of warm lead can I get? And that could just be reaching out to internal software engineers at your company and saying, where's the best company that you worked for hiring this talent? Or who is the best person? You don't have to introduce them to me, but how can I find people like them? So kind of taking those different avenues through your network. And I think for me, going back to your original question about when I fell in love with sourcing, when I realized you could do that through your network, that's when I started to really love it, because then it's not just the, as I said, skills on paper, but it's all these other things in terms of other parts of people's profiles, I guess, in terms of culture and their values and what's important to them in an organization that you start to kind of unpack.
That's such a good example, Chloe, you gave about the brother, because this is a good reminder of sometimes it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I think sometimes the beauty of sourcing is that you can't be too close minded. You have to keep your approach as wide as possible, because it's not, you have to keep tapping into different avenues,
Mm,
because you don't know at what point who is going to turn into a candidate, what conversation is going to lead into, if not a hire now, at some stage, right? And that's the beauty of sourcing. And I keep banging on about sourcing, but that's another conversation for another day. But
yeah.
thanks so much for sharing some of those examples with us. We know the tides are changing, and it's now more about eliciting a response. Like 2 years ago, even up until last year, it was about finding candidates. Now we know finding candidates is becoming, I wouldn't say a little more easier, but it's becoming a lot more harder to get a response back from candidates. What's your take on some best approaches or best hacks to reach out to candidates on LinkedIn or outside of LinkedIn to increase your reply rate? Like, what's really worked out for you, Chloe?
Yeah, we track a lot of this at the lab as well because we're always looking for new ways to experiment. If someone has a really high response rate, we're saying, what exactly did you do? Show me the template and how you crafted this and, what you picked up in a candidate's profile that got them to apply. I think like just shifting away from the spray and pray model, don't just send a blanketed template or message to all candidates, ensuring that there's something in there that is really relevant to them, that they're picking it up and they're actually reading it and saying, okay, this TA or this recruiter or sourcer has reached out to me for a very specific reason. They're not here to waste my time. And I think that's why candidates can get so frustrated. I'm guilty of it myself. If someone reaches out to me and they ask, they say, oh, I saw this about your profile, whereas if it was a very, very tailored, specific message based on my experience and why I might be interested, I'd reply regardless of whether I'm looking or not, because, they've got it right and they're doing a good job. But I think what it comes down to is having that hook, ensuring that you're making it really, really easy for the candidate to consume all the information that they need in a really short amount of time. So what we progressed from over the years was, here's a link to the job description, here's a link to our website, here's a link to a video on YouTube. And there's lots of ways to compress all of this and add them into the one space. Now, you could have a link tree, for example, and the candidate can, go through all of that and find the things that are important to them. What we found really useful is either building out a Quiller doc. Quiller are an Australian-based startup/scale-up company that we worked with in the past, and we wanted to dog food their product, and we found it really, really useful using it for us. And then also we've tried using Canva as well, which is very simple to use. But basically what we do is we create a doc that will attract candidates to a specific role. So for example, let's say I'm looking for a head of engineering. The top of that document is some sort of message around the vision or the mission or the impact that they can have in the role. Then we have details of the job description. And as they continue scrolling down, they'll see pictures of the people that will be their peers or maybe the engineering managers that are reporting into them. And then they can have a look at their profiles on LinkedIn or wherever if they choose. We've got all the information in there. And again, I'll preface this. We predominantly work with smaller companies, startups and scale-ups. So they're doing a lot of this for the first time and they wouldn't have, very in-depth sourcing methodologies or anything. So it's all very new for us. But then as we scroll down, it would be, this is the funding stages. So giving them this story that they don't have to go find all of this themselves, because again, a lot of the companies that we work with, they've got old websites. They're not going to demonstrate who they are and their values and their culture because they've got different priorities right now, and that's finding customers. So it's about putting all that information in the one space, making it easy to consume in a short amount of time. And then the candidate saying, that company looks great. I'm going to reply and I want to hear more about this.
I love that you gave the Quiller example, because I remember when you were on Mike Keating's podcast, you had spoken in depth about this. And I love that. I love the whole sort of end-to-end process and approach that you all took. And obviously the impact that it had on bringing candidates into the process was wild. And it sort of reminds me of, you must always A/B test, right? And see what's working and what's not working. And if it's not working, then you need to change your approach entirely. And I remember I did this A/B testing, especially when ChatGPT came out. What I did was I sent maybe about 10, 15 people a poem. Obviously, it was more catered to that. I had more open rates, but I didn't get the best of reply rates. And then what I did was, obviously, I always, with my sequences, I always personalize each and every sequence that goes out. It's a lot more time consuming, but I had more reply rates. I had like almost 76% reply rate. And I realized that while people were opening it and they were clicking more on the poem, maybe they enjoyed what was written in it, they were not responding back. Then I remember once when I started using ChatGPT, I had done this Jon Snow related sort of message that I sent out to this candidate who liked Game of Thrones. It was a hit. And I realized, again, personalization is key. I was A/B testing all these messages, and personalization is key. And we also have to remember that majority of the people, I think it's over 60% of the people, are reading these messages on their mobile.
Yeah.
So when you're flicking, you have to, even if you're sharing your job links, they have to be mobile friendly, because on your mobile, they automatically read as they're really long text messages anyways. So we have to keep these considerations in mind. Cloë, one last question, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is what are some common misconceptions about sourcing that have come your way, and how have you tackled them?
I think the biggest one is more is more. So the more candidates that you reach out to, the more responses you will get. But that also means the more phone calls you're having, the more candidates you have to reject. And I think that's something that I did at the very start. And I was targeted against outreach messages on LinkedIn or contacts with candidates. And then I remember shifting my mindset. I'm like, hold on, if I only have to speak to 7 candidates, why don't I do that? And these are going to be 7 candidates that are, I've written really detailed, or sorry, not really detailed, but very specific catered messages to those candidates. They've come back to me. I'm having in-depth conversations that are really relevant. And then hopefully one of those gets the job. Because one thing that I feel really uncomfortable with is when I reach out to a candidate, I screen them and then I have to reject them. Because of course, your initial message is going to be really like that you've got this experience. It could be suitable for what we're looking for. And the candidate's like, okay, they're headhunting me. Perspective shifts because now I have to pitch and sell the company and the role to them. And then if they decide, yeah, okay, I'm interested, and then I reject them, really, really poor candidate experience. And just again, a waste of time. So I think getting really specific and clear at the beginning, as you mentioned earlier, like do your A/B testing. But what I usually do is your ABC candidates. So your A bucket is your 10 out of 10s. They're the ones that you're spending most of your time on. You're writing those very specific messages and you're reaching out to them first. And let's say that's 20 candidates. And then you get a high response rate because, it's very specific and catered, etc. And then you go through those and then you assess maybe after a few days, out of those 20 candidates that I've reached out to, maybe 5 have come back to me, I've spoke to 4, and 3 are progressing through. And then it's next step. What do I need to do to fill that funnel again to get maybe 2 or 3 more candidates and ensure that they're moving through? So I think doing that in a very smart way where you don't have to panic spray out on LinkedIn or something where you're like, oh, I need to hire 2 software engineers. I'm going to reach out to 150 candidates today. And then all of a sudden you come in the next day and you've got all these candidates that you now have to speak to. And it's just a bit overwhelming and it's not manageable because you've probably got about 10 other roles on at the same time as well.
While you were discussing that and mentioning when you have to call candidates and reject them after reaching out to them, that's something you dislike. This is something I've thought about for a while now, is that should we be changing our approach? When we are reaching out to passive candidates, do we need to change our interview process slightly? Not because we have to obviously make sure that no biasness creeps in, but we are reaching out to passive candidates. Should we have the same process that we do for applicants that are directly applying? And I've always had this question in my head that do we need to slightly change our approach?
I would change it based off of the candidate's profile. So for example, if I reached out to a head of candidate, I would preface the conversation and say, this is for you to find out more about us. And then when I speak to them on the phone, I'll say, look, I want to share, the company's story and background and tell you more about the team and the role and the opportunity. If all of that sounds good on your end, if we have time, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? So I say that at the very start of the conversation, and then either we'll get in and they say, this sounds great. And naturally, they want to tell me more about themselves because they want to be a good fit for the role. Or they say, there's a misalignment here somewhere, and that's fine. We don't waste our time and we cut the conversation short. On the flip side of that, if it's a candidate who's applied, I would usually start, and it depends. If they're really, really strong, I would still start by sharing a bit more about the company, about the role of the team, etc. And then I'll say, I'm doing this so you can understand us better, but also cater your answers to what we need. If the candidate is maybe a 6 or 7 out of 10 and I've got some concerns, I will always start the conversation by asking them questions. And in a screening call, my screening calls are usually 30 minutes, maybe 45 for a leader. But within that call, at least then I can cut that short, give them feedback in the moments and say, look, this is actually what we're looking for. You don't have this kind of experience. I'll wrap it up here, but look out for roles in the future kind of thing. So yeah, I think you're right. It does depend. And I think that's also be like the art and the craft of what we do. It's just not being robotic and having the exact same approach to every single candidate that we speak to, but being smart in how we work and ensuring that regardless they're getting a great experience, whether that's an outreach message, whether it's an email of scheduling something, or whether that's a call. We need to ensure that we give them a great experience, but it's always going to be catered to where they're coming from, applicant, referral, etc.
And I feel like, and this is my personal opinion, is I tend to think that it comes down to an education piece with the hiring managers to make them understand that sometimes passive candidates and referrals at times need a bit more of an extra TLC in the process. Because if someone's been referred and you don't kind of treat them a little extra special, should I say, you're kind of doing a disservice. And what's going to happen is your referral program or your referrals are going to dwindle down drastically because of that experience. So it goes down to letting your hiring managers know where these people are coming from, how you found them. But I also feel, and based on my experience, I've seen that when you bring passive versus direct applicants into the process, if they're getting the same level of experience, which is also good, what also happens is that your passive candidates, when you've done a lot more hard work from the get-go around finding these people, getting them interested, bringing them into the process, but then they get this different sort of experience that's not consistent with what you've been telling them.
Yeah.
That suffers broadly. Mm-hmm. Because for hiring managers, it's so important for them to realize if it's a passive candidate, you have to do a little extra sell in that interview. It's not just about you interviewing and asking questions and grilling them. You have to do a little extra sell because they're still passive. While they've come into your process, they're still not sure if they want to join the company or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that actually, for all candidates, it needs to be a two-way conversation. We are always interviewing them, but in one way or another, they're interviewing us as well. They're having those consistent checkpoints with regards to values and culture. Do I want to work with these people? Am I seeing diversity in the panel? How do they treat one another? How are they treating me? Because if you have a bad experience in a recruitment process or even your onboarding, like what's that going to look like for the rest of your career in that company? And it also happens on the flip side as well. And it's important that we work really closely with the people function. So if we're giving them, this 10 out of 10 experience, taking them through the talent process, and then we make the hire, let's hope there's a laptop ready for them on day one. Let's hope that they're getting all the information that they need before that, so we can keep that momentum up and they're coming into the company with that enthusiasm and motivation.
Cloë, this has been amazing. And I'm so thankful and grateful that you said yes to coming onto the podcast. So thank you so much once again, Cloë. And you and I continue this conversation for hours talking about sourcing and talking about recruitment in general. But thank you once again.
Thank you, Denise. This was awesome.
Thank you. And everybody stay crafty. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. And we'll be back next week with another exciting episode. If you found this valuable, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. That helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Once again, happy sourcing and stay crafty. Until next time.